This is Zach Petrock, and welcome to the Form of Anatomy, the Skull and Facial Muscles. Let's go ahead and start by taking a look at the completed model that we'll be creating today. And this process is going to be a little bit different than what we did in part 1, where we covered the muscles of the body, in that with this video we're actually going to be creating these forms from box meshes, so low resolution meshes, and we're going to actually be going in and applying different ZBrush techniques to create the majority of these facial forms. So let's go ahead and get started by taking a look at the skull, and we'll start by talking about some of the features as well as the main planes and plane changes in the skull and how those relate to the muscles that we'll be creating. So we'll go ahead and start in side view here. You'll notice that the top part of the skull actually hits as a high point towards the back here. So almost 3/4 of the way back, you can see that angled surface on the top, and then that other hit right there as it angles down again. And really, this can change greatly, and it can be very flat back there, or it can actually angle out as it goes from the ground up towards the top of the skull. But that's something just to be aware of as you're creating your character and looking at that form. Moving on down to the teeth here, just wanted to point out that typically the teeth and the angle of those teeth as they attach to the skull is not flat to the world, so it's not horizontal to the ground plane. This actually has a pretty strong angle to it, as well as this lower part of the jaw. So that lower jaw line, and then how that's related to the line of the teeth as well, is very important. And also want to talk really quickly about this part right here, the muzzle that I just pulled out. And there's almost always a contour there, so a curvature to that in both directions. Alright, and moving back and looking at the center point of the skull here, that's of course where the ear comes off of, and that typically marks the front part of the ear, so the back of the ear would be right in here. And moving into front view, here you can see towards the top of the skull, what we're really looking at right here is that point that's about 3/4 of the way back from the side. Because again, the front part of the skull up towards the forehead is a lot lower. And I just want to point out this space right here, we're pulling the jaw out. Notice how far inset that typically is from that zygomatic arch there, the lower part of the eye socket. That's going to let some muscles set in there that we'll talk about in a minute. So kind of looking at that form as it wraps around and down. And here you can see, also from front view, notice how the head is angling out, so it's actually wider back here than it is in front up towards the eye socket there as well. And we'll talk about that again in a minute as we go into top view here. So this is probably an easier view to take a look at that in, and you can really see how it's angling in as it goes from back to front. So definitely wider right here around this 3/4 point, almost at that same point as the high point is in side view as well. So again, all those things are big structural changes or big structural form planes that really help us set up how these muscles are going to lay into place here. There's that front view of the muzzle, really looking at that arch as well. So this is very important. Let me hide the jaw. You can really see how that arcs around. So here, that really strong arch is going to help set up that muzzle. So the side view again has the arc, as well as this bottom view. So this is a good view. I typically come into this view a lot when I'm sculpting a character's head, just to really make sure that I've gotten that arc correct. And obviously, depending on the squareness of the jaw, that's going to vary. But it's almost always better for me to start with an over-exaggerated arch, and then it almost always ends up flattening out anyway. Alright, and this is one other area that's really tricky and important, but really notice the hit in that surface change, the really quick change on what would be the cheekbone there. And that's going to allow a lot of muscles to attach right into that area and then fan out down towards the mouth. So, and we're going to be discussing those in more detail, and again, that's a really difficult area, but because that muzzle is out further and in space from that cheekbone, and it really helps set up the forms that have to go in between there to span that space again from the cheekbone down towards the mouth. Now, before we get started with the individual muscles of the face, I wanted to just talk about a few main planes of the face, so simplified planes that have helped me understand a little bit more of the structure and how all these things are fitting together. So these are all some really difficult areas, the lips, and then again that area between the muzzle and the cheekbone, as well as the eyes. So those are the three main planar areas that we're going to be discussing. And really these are just planes that I've created to kind of help me in a way simplify these forms, because again these are really complex forms. What I had to do when I was really struggling with this is just simplify it to the most basic form I could, and then really try to understand what was happening. So here what I've done is made one simple plane that's representing the lips. So obviously the mouth is a really difficult area, particularly as it comes into the corner here. But essentially what I tried to do was think of this as one solid transitioning plane. So I guess you could say it's similar to a rubber band in that it's attached and it actually loops back around on itself. But really what I try to do is place this plane and then really understand where the normal of the surface is pointing. So obviously at the corners here and at these outside edges, it's almost folding over on top of itself, or just like a rubber band if you were to flatten it out. So the mouth essentially does the same thing, where it really flattens out at those corners. But here you can see as it goes towards what would be the middle of the lip, it actually changes direction. So here you can see the normals are facing almost in opposite directions. So one really angling down and then one angling up. Obviously that's going to change with each individual person's lips, and those angles vary greatly, but what really helped me was just understanding that, okay, this is one plane, and typically those two angles are going to play off of each other in some way as they transition towards the center of the mouth, so that it made it a lot easier for me to either look at my drawing and design and or life model and try to capture exactly what was going on there. And again, it was simplifying this shape and the form that really helped me understand it. So, and we will be talking more about the muscles that wrap around the lips, and we'll be developing this plane in greater detail, and hopefully be able to point out some of those other muscles around those edges there that make this probably one of the most difficult areas of the face, or the easiest to do the wrong way. And let's move on to this next plane here, this transitional plane. The one we briefly mentioned before when we were talking about the skull, that's actually bridging that distance between this area here, so the back part of the head and the muzzle up here. So you really tend to have this band of a surface that's going between that cheekbone down towards the mouth and the muscles that essentially wrap around the mouth. And this is an area that still tends to cause trouble for me because it is so complex. There are really a lot of different things going on here. But you can see now we turned on the wireframe, and really looking at this plane and this shape, we have a lot of muscles that originate up here along the cheekbone and then again fan out down towards the mouth. So they really kind of go in this direction, a direction that follows those edges, those black lines that are on my plane right now. But the difficult part is that the skin, and because those muscles as they contract actually pull that surface along its length, the skin actually tends to wrinkle along what would be the length of this plane. So it was really difficult for me trying to understand the anatomy and learn all those muscles. But in reality, what typically happens on the surface, because of the skin and the fatty tissues that are over those muscles, you actually get kind of an opposite effect with these creases that are running along this way. But there are typically a lot of creases in and around that area. The main smile crease that can come up and wrap all the way around the back side of the nostril, and then wrap all the way down here, down towards the bottom of the jaw as well. So again, the main thing I wanted to point out, and just I think it's worth reiterating again here, is that when we talk about these muscles, they really, in some ways, they just set the tone for this form, but they don't really show you what's going to be happening on the surface. So again, just something to keep in mind, and then as we get into those muscles, again, we'll be talking more about maybe where some of those skin folds take place. But again, thinking about those skin folds as wrapping along really the length of this form. And there are a few different ones. You can have the top one that comes in from behind the nostril, wrapping down and around more or less again your smile line. And then we'll talk about one more that comes up from the bottom too. Alright, let's go ahead and move on to this plane and surface right here above the eye. Now this varies greatly, obviously depending on the type of person. It also varies greatly between, typically, again, between a man and a woman. But the orientation of this plane is very important, so how flat it is to the ground. I just went ahead and masked the other planes off so we don't move them, so we can kind of take a look at adjusting this plane here, see what's going on. Use the transpose tools to move and rotate it a little bit. But here you can see how it comes down from the top of the forehead, and just really looking at this as a surface. And what I try to do is take a look at this, depending on the orientation first, kind of set that up. And this can vary depending on how far out the eyes are as well. So different people's eyes are set back further or come out further. But really try to set that plane up first to try to identify what type of global characteristics do I want this character's eyes to have. And then also taking a look at how it transitions, similar to how the lips transition, where they might have a normal that faces in one direction as the plane starts on the outside here, and then as it transitions in and curves around that eye, the normal of this plane or that surface can really change. And obviously depending on the person or the character that you're trying to create, that really can change drastically. And the other thing I like to do is think of this plane as something that intersects the eyelids. So just bringing the muscles of the eye back here real quickly, this plane doesn't represent the eyelids at all. It's just this main surface that fills that gap between the eye and the bone that is particularly up around this top area here. And then really understanding how much of this upper surface overlaps the eyelids. Sometimes on some older men typically, this form can actually come out further than the eyelid. And it can actually overlap and kind of fold back on itself. And then from a lot of views you can't even see the upper eyelid at all. So again, those are just some simplified versions of those muscles and the shapes and essentially everything that makes up those masses, and just a few things that really helped me out as I was trying to first decipher all this. So I've gone ahead and put two of the main muscles in here already. Let's start down here with the masseter. And I decided, there's not much form development in these shapes. They're really kind of straightforward, just from one origin point to an insertion point. And I wanted to spend more time focusing on more complex forms like the eyelids and the nose and the mouth. So I just went ahead and threw these in here, but just want to take a second to talk about them. You can see how this lower muscle here, this masseter muscle, it's what helps contract the jaw. So when you're chewing, and it originates on this zygomatic arch here, the cheekbone, the lower side, and then wraps down to the jaw. So that's important for the squareness of the jaw as well. And also wanted to just throw this one in here, the temporalis muscle. You can see how it attaches down here onto the jaw and helps with chewing as well. So this is why during animation, as the jaw's moving, if someone's talking or really shouting, open their jaw wide, that you typically see movement up here along the side of the head. So again, as that flexes, it helps close the jaw, and then sometimes you get a little bit of a bulge there on the side. But this is also the muscle from front view that we're going to see, and if we didn't set up that plane properly on the skull, having it narrower in the front and then wider towards the back, then we wouldn't get the proper read on this muscle from the front view as well, because it does layer on top of it. So again, we're going to see more of that muscle from the front view. We're going to see more of the back of that muscle as well. So again, just wanted to throw those in there. They're pretty straightforward, and they really just kind of help fill out those forms and give us a good starting point. Let's go ahead and begin with the mouth. You can see that I've made a few different box forms, so one for the mouth, one for the nose and the eyes and the ears. And what I've tried to do is make them as low res as possible. So I just made these boxes in Maya and then imported them in. So again, really low res, simple shapes there. But you could also use Z-spheres to do those. Doesn't really matter. I just like to keep them as low as possible so that I have more freedom and I don't have to fight the topology as I'm progressing. So you can see here what I've already started to do is define the shape of those lips just by a lot of pushing and pulling. So I will be using hotkeys here to switch between the tools that I use. So here you can see I'm using the pinch brush with the lazy mouse. And I'm just starting to kind of slowly define where I want these shapes to be. And I'm also using the move brush to push and pull those points into place to some degree. So you can see how I've actually pulled a line into position that's going to represent the midline between the lips. So between the upper and lower lip, I've actually pulled an edge into place. But again, because these edges are somewhat straightforward, they're just going horizontal and vertical, gives me a lot of leeway if I ever need to change that line. I'm not fighting any edge loops or things like that to make these shapes change if need be. See here, the other nice thing about ZBrush is that whenever we need to, we can go ahead and turn on transparency just to take a look at where the mouth is oriented relative to the teeth. We'll talk more about that again as we progress here. And let's go ahead and step up one more level of detail. Come back in with the pinch brush. You can see this is a great area to use the pinch brush in because as I'm brushing across the surface there between the lips as well as on the outer contour edge of those lips, it's actually pulling some of those edges into position so you can get a really well-defined form change. And as we're talking about some of the muscles around here, the main muscle that wraps all the way around the lips, the orbicularis oris, is one of the main forms there. But we're going to be integrating a few different muscles into this one cube. So the one mouth form that we have here, the one subtool, is going to be containing a lot of different muscles. And as we come back to the mouth, we'll be talking more about those and talk about them in greater detail as well and see how they really start to interact and create some of the form changes that we're talking about. You can already see to a degree where towards the corner of the mouth we're starting to get that bunching up of the shape. So a little bit of that fullness that's coming out and wrapping around that transitional plane that we talked about earlier. And let's go ahead and move on to the eyes, at least the first pass of the eyes. What I like to do in this situation is kind of go through and give everything a first pass. So we'll take a look at all the main features and some of the muscles of the face here, and we'll just kind of get them roughed in and start to conform some of the edges to the complex shapes that we need. And then as a secondary pass, we'll go back in and we'll really define some of those individual muscles, and we'll also talk about giving them some character. So even though we're just talking about the musculature and the skull here, we do eventually attach this back to the body and the skeleton that we created in part 1 in Muscles of the Form. So we do want this to relate to that, and just to make it a little more interesting, we'll try to give the skull and muscles a little bit of character so you can read what type of a character we're actually creating with this, so it's not just another benign kind of muscle study. So you can see here using a lot of the same techniques. When we start with those low resolution box meshes, end up using a lot of the move brush in combination with the pinch brush and lazy mouse. So you can see just starting to look at that basic form there, and then come back in with the lazy mouse and start to define the eyelids. So at this stage, the eyelids are fairly simple shapes. They're just wrapping right around and following the sphere, which is that secondary subtool we have in there to represent the eyes. And now, coming up on top of the eye, thinking back to that transitional plane that we created earlier, really just starting to look at that form and see how I want that to be oriented. The orientation of that upper plane, again, we talked about being very important. Notice how when I'm making global changes like that, so I just reposition the eye as I develop these things, sometimes I'll realize how far off I initially was. But again, when we're talking about big changes, really moving a lot of that surface, I always want to step back down to that lowest level. And that's why it's also nice in this situation to have a really low resolution to go back down to, because then it allows you to make really fast, global changes. And now let's go back in with the move brush and clean up some of these forms here. A lot of times when you do start with an unorganized mesh, the one thing you have to be careful of is that you can get a lot of indentations or bulges in your form that you didn't necessarily want to have there. So for me, the quick fix for that is to just go in, once I've basically blocked out the main forms, go in with the move tool and just start to tweak those out. Particularly when you're talking about areas like the eyelids that are going to have to be more of a truer form because you want them to obviously conform directly to the eye itself. Alright, let's go ahead and move on to the first pass of the nose. And we will be sculpting a few of the muscles during the second pass, but mainly what we're going to be focusing on is the cartilage, so this lower structure here, the nose. And obviously because it is cartilage, it can vary greatly in your character between the nose and the ears. Those are two of the features that vary the most because they are mainly cartilage. But I'd like to just talk about some of the main forms that make up these shapes, and we'll talk a little bit about the nostrils and some of the other shapes as well, and some of the typical hit points that I look for as a starting point. So a lot of times for me it helps to kind of block these things in, understanding how the forms, or what is underneath these forms that typically creates the shapes, and then from there I can go ahead and vary it to make it conform to whatever specific character or character type I'm trying to create. And going in here and looking at those two forms on the tip of the nose, I kind of hit there and take the lazy mouse and pinch brush as well. Kind of help define this nostrils, and these nostrils, or the shape of the nostrils, vary greatly depending on the shape of the nose. Obviously if the nose is flatter, then the nostrils from that bottom view can have a longer orientation, so they can kind of run along the length of the face, or they can be oriented in this direction where they're actually kind of starting from the upper lip area and then orienting straight out almost, or angling out all the way towards the tip of the nose. So you can already see here we're just starting to hint at some of these planar changes, even this planar change on the nostril, the bottom side of the nostril there, and looking at that edge of the nostril, seeing how straight or curved or angled it is, if there's a hit point to it. And looking at some of those other shapes in there as well, some of that cartilage. But again, these obviously vary greatly, but I'm just going to try to block in some things that we can use as a starting point, and then hopefully as we kind of come back to the nose and really define it to a much further degree and kind of talk about our character specifically, then we can go ahead and talk more about some of these parts and why we're choosing to do it in a certain way. All right, you can see it pretty quick to just get that basic form that we need to start from for the nose. And let's go ahead and move on to the ear. And we'll start with a very similar approach to the way we address the mouth and the nose. Just come right in with the move tool and really start to manipulate some of these edges and just roughly put them in the place that we'll need them to define the forms. So looking at that outer shape of the ear, even from vac view, that helix of the ear, that outer ring, and we'll be talking more about the specifics of these features again as we progress and we come back on that second pass. But really looking at it from all different angles here, noticing that S shape to it from the back view, and obviously this varies greatly. But for this character, just want to give it a lot of form as it kind of changes and wraps around there. Looking at that tragus, that little hit point that is right in front of the whole of the ear. Then just come in and roughly look at that shape, that Y shape in there, the antihelix. So really not trying to pull too much out of the form when I'm in these initial stages. So when it's a really low res like this, really just kind of push and pull and to a degree torture the mesh and not worry about how triangulated it gets or how jagged it gets. Again, turn on that transparency. It's a nice way to just check the position of the ear and make sure it's right where we want it, towards the back there, right at the back of that arch for the cheekbone. Alright, and come back in and just start to block in these shapes again. Really, I think of the ear in these two major shapes, that helix, that outer ring to it, and then that antihelix, that Y-shaped form that comes around right there on the inside. And really, those two tend to meet towards the bottom down here at the lobe as they wrap around. Use a little bit of the standard brush here. The ear's a little trickier in that you have a shape that's out from the surface of the head, so it can pull back in on itself if you're not careful. So I want to make sure I'm going to do a little bit from this view, and that's why I'm also developing the back view at the same time. I want to make sure I don't collapse the mesh on itself. Coming back here, if that does happen, I just use the inflate brush to get some of that form back again, but better to fix it now than later. Come back in with the pinch brush lazy mouse combination to pull some of those edges into position. And looking at this shape here, you can see that form is what angles the ear outward. So the greater or the distance of that form, then obviously the more angled the ear is going to be and the further it's going to stick out. Alright, let's move on to our second pass. And I'm going to start by using the transpose master here and just pulling out this jaw a little bit. I want the jaw to be a little more pronounced and the chin to be a little further forward. So I'll go ahead and by using that transpose master tool, it'll just pull all those subtools at the same time. And you can find that under the download section at pixelogic.com. But now that we've pulled that jaw out a little bit further, we can start to really put some more character into the features that we're developing for our face. And you can also see that I've pulled down the bottom of the subtool for the mouth so that we can add a few different muscles, some of the lower chin muscles, into this same subtool. And again, we're going to do that because so many of them do intersect and overlap that it's a lot easier, I think more effective to define the form by keeping them as one subtool. So again, making a little bit more broader changes there. I always want to step back down to that lower level and then go in and kind of clean up some of those thoughts that I started to put in the higher levels here. Back to the pinch brush with the lazy mouse. Also use a lot of smoothing as well. Again, we talked about having a bumpy surface or a lot of depressions in your surface, so I do a lot of additive where I'll move or I'll use the standard brush and pull some of those forms out. And if I do get some of those bumps or depressions in the surface, then I'll go ahead and quickly hit it again with the smooth brush. Just adjusting that chin a little bit more. Again, I know that I want it to be further out, kind of a stronger chin. But again, we're talking about the muscles in this situation, so we needed to also pull out the jaw, and then we can pull out the muscles that are going to layer on top of it.